Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Disassembly Required. As always, I am your host, Jolene, and today we are going to be talking about cosmic horror. Now, what is cosmic horror? Undoubtedly, some of you have probably heard this term before. Well, cosmic horror is a certain brand of horror that more so relies on the use of the human mind and humanity as a whole, and how humanity seeks to understand, in a sense. It really stems from the idea of what is beyond human understanding. Not necessarily what we don't know, but what we are incapable of knowing. Now, cosmic horror was invented, actually, by a man by the name of H.P. Lovecraft. Now, H.P. Lovecraft was a very interesting individual. Lovecraft was a only child from Rhode Island, Providence, Rhode Island, in fact. And many of his early inspirations for stories came from his father, who inspired him by reciting old tales from classical literature and English poetry, as well as tales that his father created himself that were inspired by early Gothic horror. It was very early that Lovecraft actually began writing, as at age 7 he began writing poems that restyled stories such as the Odyssey and general mythology stories. He said that as a child he was enamored by the Roman pantheon of gods, which is interesting because most people generally tend to gravitate towards the Greek pantheon. And it was very interesting, of course, because as one later sees in Lovecraft's more famous works, he very much has his own pantheon of gods that he has created. More on that later, of course. It would actually, in fact, be years later that his first poem that was not self-published would appear in the local newspaper in 1912, and the poem was called Providence in 2000 AD. Now, of course, his vision of 2000 was probably very different than what 2000 turned out to be, as we often see with those kinds of stories. It's very funny stuff looking back on it, but people used to think like that back then. Quick side note, before the invention of cars, people used to think that in the future people would get around on motorized horses. They couldn't imagine just the carriage itself being motorized. It had to be the horse carrying the carriage, which is very, very interesting to me. But yes, that poem and another one of his poems, the name of which I refuse to say because it has a slur, and I do not say slurs. But that poem and another one of his poems, I think there was actually a couple other ones as well, from what I can gather, were also very much sort of the beginnings of the sort of xenophobia and racism that was a lot more visible in his later work, albeit a bit more hidden, I guess you could say. Or I guess you could say he was a bit more creative with how he presented it. And of course, he gained a amount of fame over the years through his many stories, such as The Mountains of Madness, Shadow of the Town of Innsmouth, and The Call of Cthulhu. He, of course, died March 15th in 1937, so before the United States even became a part of World War II, which is kind of strange to think about. But he did, of course, he was, of course, alive during the time of the First World War, which most likely helped to shape his views of humanity and everything. Interestingly enough, there's groups of people who do actually observe the anniversary of his death and his birth at his gravesite. And in July of 2013, the Providence City Council designated a H.P. Lovecraft Memorial Square and installed a commemorative sign at the intersection of Angel and Prospect Streets, near the author's former residences. In 2016, Lovecraft was inducted into the Museum of Pop Culture's Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame, which is pretty huge. For a very long time, in fact, H.P. Lovecraft left his mark in the form of the World Fantasy Awards. The prize for the awards, or rather the winners, those who were awarded, were presented with an elongated bust of Lovecraft that was based off of a design from a cartoonist. And this was from the first World Fantasy Awards were held in 1975, and until 2015, that bust was presented as the award. But it was in August of 2014 that a petition was started to change the award from a bust of Lovecraft to a bust of Octavia Butler. It was argued that this was not out of disrespect for Lovecraft necessarily, but more so as a celebration of the kinds of authors that were being more and more visible throughout these years. Octavia Butler, of course, was an African-American author. Very, very interesting stories. I'd highly recommend taking a look at those. I'm not sure. I don't have any specific recommendations, but I may when I upload this, I may have some in the description. But through this petition and campaign that was done, it was announced in November of 2015 that the World Fantasy Award Trophy would no longer be modeled on H.P. Lovecraft, which is good, especially because he wasn't a very great guy. He had a lot of really, like I said before, he was very xenophobic and very racist, which we'll get into a bit more later. So, of course, like I mentioned earlier, Lovecraft had some early influences on his life when it came to the creation of his stories. His grandfather, of course, influencing him with his tales of Gothic horror and classic literature, but he was also influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, of all people. Both of them actually have some literary similarities, which is really interesting, mostly because, of course, both of them do have a very important place in horror. Edgar Allan Poe, of course, relying a bit more on the suspense and thriller aspect, and really just being able to nail that down, while, of course, H.P. Lovecraft created his own subgenre of horror. But H.P. Lovecraft was very much inspired by the universe itself. Biology, astronomy, physics, all that, like the sciences. He was very much inspired by what those meant for humanity and how those really put humanity's place in the universe into perspective for him. He saw the human race as a whole as insignificant, powerless, and doomed, which is definitely, definitely very obvious given his work and the way that the beings in his mythos interact with humans. A big portion of his stories revolves around the pantheon he had created. So, as I mentioned earlier, he was, of course, inspired by the Roman pantheon of gods, but when H.P. Lovecraft set out to create his own stories, his own pantheon, he created gods that did not care for humanity in that sense. He created gods that simply represented parts of the universe. And as such, of course, really didn't give a shit about pretty much anything. It's very strange how he describes a lot of these creatures, because while some of them may have some similarities to humans, for instance, Cthulhu is often depicted as being anthropomorphic. He usually has like a human body. Well, I say human, but he usually has a humanoid body. 2 arms, 2 legs, something akin to feet, claws. Well, I mean, humans don't really have claws, but But other creatures in his mythos are very much different. Some of them are literally just masses of things, and it's quite strange to try to envision that. It's interesting because in his letters between him and one of his proteges, he referred to his mythology as Yog Sothothery. Sothothery? Sothothery. Yeah, Yog Sothothery. And that is one of the gods he had created. But it is interesting because he referred to his mythology as that, when now we refer to it as the Cthulhu mythos, as Cthulhu, for some reason, became one of the more popular stories. Perhaps it is because of the idea that he is trapped here on Earth, under our ocean, in a forgotten city. There were lots of themes that were created through his work. Well, not necessarily created, but inspired his work, of course. One of those major themes was the idea of forbidden knowledge. Things that were simply just too vast, too understandable, not understandable, too just out of reach for humanity. Things that just really were not, people weren't capable of understanding or thinking about, which is really interesting because of just the way that he personified that through his creatures or through the situations that happened in his stories. It's interesting, of course, because a lot of the characters that he has are, of course, driven by curiosity, as a lot of human beings are. Of course, probably like the most prominent tenet of science is the statement, "I do not know," because it precedes observation and investigation. And in H.P. Lovecraft's stories, a lot of the knowledge that they create, or not that they create, that they understand or find, seems to be destroying in a sense. It destroys them psychologically and fills them in a sense with regret for having sought this and found this out, which is absolutely terrifying, because a lot of people, you just want to find things out, and it's not necessarily a terrifying concept for a lot of people, just simply learning things. But then when put into perspective of you're not just learning things, you're learning things that are truly outside of what you are supposed to know. That's some hard stuff to really grasp. The beings, of course, in H.P. Lovecraft's stories were often, of course, worshipped, as any god would be. Because, humanity always likes to, I don't know, just give up. It's like, oh, hey, look, it's a thing that we can put all of our hopes, dreams, and fears into. Let's just do that instead. Because, trying to actually make our lives better is hard. Let's just ask this thing to do it for us. But many of these gods that were worshipped were, of course, done so through cults in many parts of the world in his stories. And it was interesting because of the fact that many of these beings were just insanely powerful and so horrific, either physically or just the idea of them was so horrific that just directly understanding them, like physically, would lead to insanity. Anybody who has seen the movie Bird Box, that's essentially what the movie, where that idea came from. The writer actually spoke about what he sort of envisioned when he was writing this story, like how he would create the monsters, and that's how he came up with it. I believe he said that when creating them, he wanted to imagine what it was like to stare into infinity, and that would drive somebody to madness. But it was through the use of these cults in these stories that he enabled the protagonists to feel any sort of victory, really. Because how can your main character really have any victory against a cosmic being older than probably the universe itself? Like, it's impossible. Interestingly enough, even in his time, H.P. Lovecraft actually encouraged other writers to take from his writings, to write about the Necronomicon and Cthulhu and Yog-Sothoth. And it's very interesting because of this, how much his stories have been built upon, even after his death. For instance, film is so much more of a medium now than it was in H.P. Lovecraft's day. I mean, there's a pretty substantial list of stories that have been adapted. I mean, just a short. I'm just gonna pick and choose from this list I have. Is there's the Dunwich Horror, Reanimator, From Beyond, The Curse, The Unnameable, the Necronomicon, Castle Freak, Dagon, the Call of Cthulhu, which is a black and white film that was made to look like it was released in the 20s, but it was actually released in 2005. Cthulhu, which is a film released in 2007 that was actually based on the story The Shadow over Innsmouth. Uh, The Whisper in the Darkness, which is a film that came out in 2011. And more recently this year, there's The Color Out of Space, which stars Nicolas Cage, and I have to watch it, but it's not free on Amazon Prime, so I have to find another way to watch it. Maybe I'll just break down and buy it because it's like $3 to rent or some shit, but I really don't want to. Just because I don't like spending money. Unless it's go to a movie theater, but even then I only go on the days where it's like $5. Well, not anymore, of course, because, the Backstreet Boys reunion tour. So, H.P. Lovecraft, of course, was a very interesting and prolific character. And as I mentioned before, a lot of his themes are themes that we still use today. Well, I say we, but, I mean authors, of course. Authors still use a lot of his themes, like eccentricism, forbidden knowledge, non-human influence on humanity, all that kind of fun stuff. And of course, now more than ever, his works are being adapted and, retooled and reworked because of how much easier it is to access them. I believe, and I'm not completely sure, but I believe that H.P. Lovecraft's works are currently in the public domain. For those of you who don't know, that means that nobody owns those stories. It means that you can write whatever you want with H.P. Lovecraft's stories. If you want to write a story where Cthulhu gets down and dirty with Frankenstein, you could totally do that. Please don't, but you could totally legally do that. Sorry, I just got that mental image in my head and now I can't get it out. But if you're looking for movies, I would highly, of course, recommend watching Color Out of Space. I don't know if it's good, but it's got Nicolas Cage in it, so even if it's bad, it'll still be funny to watch. Outside of his own works, though, there are, of course, movies that were inspired by H.P. Lovecraft's stories. As I mentioned, there's Bird Box, but there's also the movie Annihilation, which is really good. It came out, I believe, in 2018. Did it come out in 2018? Yes, it came out in 2018. I remember specifically because I went to see it and Black Panther on the same day. Because it was $5 movies that day, so I just saw both of them for $10. And then, excuse me, I would also highly recommend, of course, the Call of Cthulhu, and perhaps even the movie Cthulhu, just because, I mean, you gotta have a bit more of that rounding, you gotta watch a lot of it to really understand it. If you're interested in video games, I would highly recommend the Call of Cthulhu video game, in which you play as the detective who is the main character in the book, and you sort of go through it's very much like a huge interactive game. It's based off of, you have to talk to people and learn things, and it's very interesting. I'd highly recommend it. I'm hoping to soon play the Moons of Madness, which is based of course on the Mountain of Madness, which is or at the Mountain of Madness, which is a famous Lovecraft story, as I mentioned earlier. It takes place on Mars, and I'm really interested to see that because I always love space horror. I'm a huge fan of Alien, and I'm also a really huge fan of just really good space horror. I know that sounds weird, But when horror in space is done really well, like for instance Alien or Apollo 18, you get some really amazing stuff, especially like special effects wise, of course. Um, Another game that I might recommend, but it might not necessarily be in everybody's wheelhouse, is Bloodborne. Bloodborne relies a lot off of a similar sort of setup as to some of H.P. Lovecraft's stories, which is like an older, more Victorian era sort of town. And you are in this older Victorian city, and you have to essentially fight all these monsters and stuff. But a lot of these monsters used to just be people. Like all of the monsters in it are either weird strains, aliens from who knows where, or they used to just be people, and they're still conscious and aware of what they're doing, and that's also just terrifying. But I would highly recommend Bloodborne. It's very difficult, but visually speaking, and as far as like H.P. Lovecraft's work goes, it's amazing. It's absolutely fantastic. Another work I would highly recommend, of course, is, as I mentioned earlier, there's Annihilation, but there's also a book to that. And the book is absolutely amazing. I will say this, though. When you're going into cosmic horror, don't expect it to be scary in the way that, like, a horror movie is scary necessarily. Excuse me, gotta hydrate. Like for instance, I mentioned Alien earlier. Alien, of course, is a horror movie, but it's scarier because just the idea of the monster, being trapped on this space station. Yeah, and there's like pretty much no way out, and this monster's going to get you, and you have to do whatever you can to stop it. That's pretty scary, but there's also the fact of, in cosmic horror, like what that monster is, or what that monster does to people. Like, it's not necessarily the gore of a monster killing somebody, it's like, what does that monster do? Does the monster drive somebody insane? Does the monster warp reality around it? Like, it's so much more involved and in depth and intellectual, I guess you could say, than just the average horror. And I'm not trying, of course, to say that average horror is bad or anything like that. I mean, I love just regular horror movies. Like I said, I love Alien. The Conjuring was really good. I actually really enjoyed this movie that came out recently called Antrum, which I would highly recommend. It's very good, very suspenseful. Just like Annihilation, it's free on Amazon Prime. But cosmic horror is very much thinking about, it's very much sort of you, in a sense, being in a similar spot, or being in a similar mindset as the main character. You know just about as much as they do, and you both kind of want to figure out like what's going on. But unlike the main character, you're of course not subject to the wrath of space gods, which is good. I mean, I don't think most people want to be subject to the wrath of space gods. I mean, I don't think I'd want to be subject to the wrath of space gods. Put that on a shirt. That'd be wonderful. I'd wear a shirt that says I don't want to be subjected to the wrath of space gods. Sorry, more water. Yeah, so I'll leave links to all the things that I've recommended, or at least most of the things I've recommended to, I'll leave links to them in the description below. I would highly encourage any of you who have the time to go through those and just read some stories. I think, if I remember correctly, I found a website earlier that has pretty much all of Lovecraft's stories, just full free on there. And I believe it also includes a audiobook version as well for free. So have fun with that. Make sure you guys are staying safe out there. Don't wanna get them those tickets to the Backstreet Boys reunion tour. They're everywhere. So make sure you're wearing gloves and a mask, and of course, not going outside if you don't need to. So yeah, thanks everybody so much for listening. I hope you all are doing well, and if you're not, I hope that you are doing the best that you can, or at least doing what you can during these times. So stay safe and have the best day you can.